Hi Year 12, this lecture is going to be looking at conducting sociological research and the various stages a sociologist has to go through in order to practice a formal bit of research. Hopefully by the end of this lecture you'll be able to describe the importance of creating hypotheses, you'll understand what it means to operationalize a concept with an example, and you'll understand the importance of conducting a pilot study. We're also going to analyse the sampling process, so this lecture should follow the handout that you've been given in class. I've used the example of social surveys as the research method we're going to be talking about while we think about how we choose a topic and hypotheses and what have you. Social surveys are basically surveys of the population, and they can include both questionnaires and interviews. For argument's sake, in this lecture, I'll talk about them as questionnaires, but they can be very formal interviews where effectively someone would read out the questions without deviating from it. So in front of you, you've got a flow diagram of how a researcher would go about their study. We talked about it last lesson. Choosing a topic is the starting point. Now, can you remember some of the issues that will affect the topic a sociologist chooses? You might need to look back at your notes, but if you remember, funding was one of them. However, there were several others. The next thing you'll do is come up with an aim and a hypothesis. These are slightly different, and we'll be looking at them in the next slide. You also need to make sure you operationalize any of the concepts you're interested in studying. You conduct a smaller pilot study in order to make sure that your hypothesis is effective, your topic is something that you can investigate, and the method you've chosen is appropriate. You'll then go on to select a sample. At this point, you'll decide on the precise method. You'd also conduct a survey. Then you'd conduct the survey, and finally, you'll analyse your data. So, if we think about the case study of Venkatesh, he started off using a sort of informal questioning, an informal interview as his research method in Gang Leader for a Day. And if we call that his pilot study, we know that wasn't effective because he got taken hostage. So because of that pilot study, he was able to adjust his method to a much more ethnographic bit of research. Anyway, we'll come to that shortly. Aims and hypotheses. Once a sociologist has chosen their topic to investigate and chosen their method they think they're going to use, they will need to formulate an aim and then a hypothesis. The aim is a statement about what a sociologist intends to study and wants to achieve from the research. So this is an aim. This study aims to explain why there are class differences in achievement. So you've got the top area that you want to study, and you've also got what you want to achieve. You want to be able to explain why there are class differences in achievement. Hypotheses are more complex, and again, this might be something you're very familiar with if you are doing or have studied science or psychology, for example. They are much more specific. They should be possible explanations that can be tested by collecting evidence to support your hypotheses being true, or to falsify it to prove your hypotheses as false. So, for example, good hypotheses about education would be differences in educational achievement of the different social classes are the result of differences in family size. So, you can tell that this is something that can be tested. You could conduct your research, your questionnaire, and if you found that actually students from much bigger families did less well in education, you've proved your hypotheses true. However, if there's absolutely no correlation between family size and how well a student does at school, you know that you've proved your hypotheses as false. The good thing about hypotheses is it gives research a direction and a focus. But it does rely on you thinking up an explanation first before you actually conduct your research. Now, some sociologists can be critical of this, critical of the idea of going in with the hypotheses first, because it can actually lead to the researcher being somewhat biased when they look at their data or the information they're gathering. They might try and prove their hypotheses. So it's not always appropriate for all methods. So, for example, ethnography doesn't really work with the hypotheses because you don't really know what you're going to discover about these people before you kind of go into that very deep and detailed research. In order to think up an explanation, you need to look at previous research, as we looked at in the class, that example of investigating the previous research on healthy school meals. And as I mentioned before, it could be proved wrong. Now, when it comes to operationalizing concepts, this is really important. It's the idea of creating a working definition for some concepts that might mean different things to different people. So, for example, if your hypothesis is middle-class pupils achieve higher qualifications than working-class pupils because of higher parental income, you need to know what is meant by social class and what you mean by qualifications in order to research that area. So class to some person could be the job that they do. Social class to another person could be linked to the sorts of music they listen to. Class could be where they live. So you need to operationalize it and make it very clear to the people you're researching and to yourself and your team what you mean by social class. Likewise, qualifications, are you talking about GCSE qualifications? Are you talking about job qualifications? All of this stuff needs to be clarified before you get started. Otherwise, you fall into... So, what question could you ask in your social survey in order to measure class? So, after you operationalize the concept and come up with a clear definition of class, you've got to come up with a question that can measure it. So, if you establish that you're going to operationalize class based on people's occupations, a good question would be, what is your job? And this can be asked to parents to assess a child's social class. You have to be careful because obviously when you're talking about social class, it can be something quite sensitive to some people. So some people might be like, oh, I don't want to say I'm working class. They might find that offensive. Issues. How would you operationalize the following in educational research? So how would you define and come up with a clear idea of what poverty is, homelessness, disability, and this one's hard, achievement? And could you think of questions that you might be able to ask in order to measure each of those factors? Can you do that on some line paper? Again, it's not always easy to operationalize the concept. Different sociologists might do it very differently. So if one parent responds, oh, I'm an office administrator, one sociologist might say, oh, this is definitely a working class occupation, might not require educational qualifications, whereas another person might say, hang on, it's working in an office environment, that must be a middle class occupation. So again, if you do compare your research with another sociologist's research, you need to be clear about how they operationalize things like social class and other key concepts like poverty. A pilot study, unfortunately, has absolutely nothing to do with pilots. This is where a draft version of the questions, for example, if it's a social survey, is prepared and trialed. This is really important because problems can be identified, questions can be refined. So, for example, if a question was misunderstood in your pilot study, you haven't wasted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questionnaires on a question that no one would understand. Therefore, the actual survey should then be as smooth as possible. So, for example, Young and Wilmot, who did research on housework, they argued that actually men and women were doing much more equal amounts of housework in 1962. They did 100 pilot interviews to help them shape their questions on housework before they get started. And as I mentioned before, Venkatesh's attempt to gain access to the projects where he went in just asking questions to people he didn't know, arguably that's an example of a pilot study because that was him trialling a method and some very casual questions that he designed and clearly didn't work. Sampling is a really important part of sociological research. And again, some of the same concepts from psychology can be applied here. This sort of bullseye diagram quite accurately explains what it means to collect a sample. You will have the research population. So if you're studying education, it could be anyone involved in education in the United Kingdom. However, that's a huge number of people. So from that, you need to collect or pick a sampling frame. So this might be the members of the research population that you're actually interested in studying. So if you're looking at working class underachievement, you might be interested in studying school children and possibly their parents, and maybe even their teachers. That would be your sampling frame. From your sampling frame, you need to pick your actual sample. Now, these are the people that you're either going to give questionnaires to or you're going to interview with your formal questionnaire. Now, you might have noticed the respondents is different to the sample. This is because, particularly with research methods like questionnaires, like email or postal, you can't always guarantee that everyone's going to respond. And it's one of the weaknesses of questionnaires, actually, is that some of the people who do have the time to respond tend to be those with a bit more time on their hand, or they might be interested in helping out the school. So therefore, it's not actually a representative sample if you link it to things like cultural capital and educational capital. So this is when you guys have got to do a bit by yourselves. If you look in page 184 on your textbooks, you'll find a brief description of all these different sampling methods. Can you briefly annotate on your worksheet what a random sample is, a quasi-random sample, a stratified random, a quota sample, snowball sampling we actually talk about quite a lot, so that's a very good one to understand, and what is opportunity sampling. So why is it that sociologists tend to choose different sampling techniques? Well, unfortunately, the main reasons are generally practical reasons. Things like time. If your sampling frame includes all teachers, all children, all parents in the UK education system, it's very unlikely you're going to put all of those names into a hat and randomly pick out the names. It's just impractical. So in terms of time, you might limit your study maybe to one or two schools in a couple of different areas possibly. Money is also a significant problem. The more people that are in your sample, the more your research is going to cost, not only in terms of the actual sending the information out, but also analysing the information that comes in. And finally, access is quite important. If you are working with a group that doesn't really like to be studied, they might be a subculture that could be criminal or deviant in otherwise, or you might struggle to get a representative sample of boys who like to truant from school, for example, because they're not actually going to want to take part in your study. So as a result, a fully representative sample is unlikely. You're much more likely to have to use something called snowball sampling, when you might meet a person and they might introduce you to other people within the deviant group who will allow you to survey their opinions, for example. The other thing that sociologists take into account is the theoretical reasons, and this sits within the positivist versus interpretivist debate that we talked about last lesson. Positivists favour objective and quantitative data in which they can spot patterns. So their priority when it comes to a sample would always be large representative samples. However, interpretivists favour much more subjective and qualitative data, so their samples will be much smaller, so they can spend more time gathering rich and detailed information. It would be impractical to gather that level of information from a very large sample. So both practical and theoretical reasons can influence the type of sampling technique a sociologist might choose. On your worksheet, I've given you each of these 5 scenarios. What I'd like you to do, you can do it on the worksheet, I'd like you to identify what's the research population for each of these scenarios, what's the sampling frame, okay, so what's the group of people they're interested in studying, what sampling technique has each scenario actually used, and can you identify the problem with the sample being picked? Is there any weakness in it? And we'll go through this tomorrow, we'll go through that in class. Thank you.